Hi, everyone, and welcome to XPOSoft's quarterly webinar. This quarter, we're doing the topic of incorporating UAT into Agile. Do it right the first time is what my dad always said. And just to a really quick introduction to XPOSoft, we focus on two things. One of them is software QA consulting, and the other one is working with companies and actually helping them do the work, anywhere from performance testing to test automation, as well as manual testing. Just a couple house rules before we get started. You will get a recording at the end, and you can ask questions throughout the webinar as well. Don't forget to tweet any of your questions, or you can put them into the webinar panel. And don't forget to remember the hashtags when you're tweeting. My name is Phil Liu, and I've been doing these webinars for quite a while for XPOSoft. Been working with the company for 12 years, and you can see that I'm passionate about cycling and travel when I'm not actually doing any work. Today we have a special guest, and that is Cheney Ma. Cheney used to work for XPOSoft. I've known Cheney for I guess about 11 years now, and he got so good at test management that he went to go work for one of our partners called GoTo Group. Cheney is what I consider to be a guru in Jira and configuring Jira. He's also a certified professional by Atlassian, and so it's great to have Cheney here, who works with dozens of customers with GoTo Group in helping them configure their Jira. Welcome, Cheney.
Hello, everyone. Thanks, Phil.
So what are your passions outside of work, Cheney?
I would like to actually learn something new and help other people, something
Yeah.
like that. Yeah.
Okay. All right. So let's move on and get to the heart of it. This is kind of a circular picture, actually, of the software development lifecycle. And as you can see from the dashed lines and the different colors, a lot of times there is some ambiguity in going from one step to another. And in particular, when you finally deliver the software to the end user is not totally satisfied. And the reason for that is the end user and the actual business needs are not communicated well to begin with, and then at each step along the way, going from the business needs to the person or the company that's building the software to the actual developers, there's all these different filters of communication, and somehow things get lost along the way. So where is testing in Agile? This is a waterfall picture, but as you can see, verification and maintenance, where is the actual testing take place? And I bring up that word verification because verification, I think, is what has happened in Agile testing, because we're going so fast and iterating so fast, all we're doing is checking, right? So checking is not the same thing as testing. And so I think what's happening is that with these quick iterations, as testers and as members of the team, we're going through it and making sure it works the way it's supposed to work, and we're accepting it. But maybe, one, we need to do more real thorough testing, and two, maybe we shouldn't be the ones that are accepting it. And that brings me to this slide here, which originally was done by a colleague of mine, Jason Arbin, and he was talking about how we really need to get back to testing and trying to break things, and not just verifying, because testing is not equal to verification. Getting to some of the traditional UAT problems, you have a group of users They come from the different backgrounds within the company or different backgrounds outside the company, and possibly they work at the end of the development life cycle for a limited period of time. They're not trained testers, but most importantly, a lot of times they test from their own viewpoint, covering common scenarios that they may be interested in executing rather than executing or exercising the software from a holistic point of view or from other people's point of view where the software may integrate with other pieces. And so when I look at Agile and some of the, here I put that in quotes because this is direct from the Agile Manifesto, I'm trying to search out and find where testing and where quality fits into Agile. I see one word here I highlighted in blue, working software. But does working software equal to quality software? I'm not quite sure about that. And hopefully we can resolve some of those issues today in going over an Agile process where we can fit in and put testing and user acceptance testing into the process and increase the quality of your software developed in an Agile manner. You know, I look at, this is another other quotes from the Agile Manifesto, and I'm trying to figure out, you know, where is the quality and the testing? And I don't really see it anywhere. We can kind of imply it, though, in a few different ways. When we're trying to put quality in Agile, we can imply it because valuable software is achieved through satisfying the customer. So we really need to think about, okay, how do we satisfy the customer? And two, changing requirements. Remember, Agile is supposed to welcome changing requirements. That's facilitated through the intervals or the iterations. And so thinking about that, that means that gives product management opportunities to change requirements, hopefully not within a sprint, but modifying it for the next sprint possibly, or the next release. And that brings us to really the crux of what I call UAT in Agile, and that is really focusing on the requirements, which are composed of user stories and acceptance criteria, combined with tests that are specific to those acceptance criteria. So what we're going to do today is go through the process of developing user stories along with acceptance criteria and test to match those. And what we're going to do is show you actually how to do this and implement it within Jira. And Cheney's going to be giving some live demonstration on how to configure Jira to make it work for you. So let's first start with excuse me, epics and user stories. Epic is a high-level requirement that may contain several user stories, and in order to make it more understandable, we like to break down an epic into several user stories, but we also like to break down user stories into smaller pieces of work as well, and we call those tasks. Subtasks can be used to define or break down the work further, and then we can also enter in work estimates for a user story or task, and you can either do that in hours or story points depending on how you configure your Jira. So let's look at, I'm going to turn it over to Cheney, and Cheney, I'm going to let you show us how you implement that in Jira.
Sure. Can you see my screen now?
Yeah, it looks great.
Yeah, here I just log into my Jira server.
Mm-hmm.
Now let's just open a single epic to have a quick look. So you see here the issue type is epic. So you can put some feature description in Jira field, which is called description. You can add some bullets there with feature description. So Jira natively don't have any feature for requirement hierarchy. So you need some other plugins, for example, SynapseRT to support that. So usually For an epic, as Phil mentioned, it is a high-level requirement. Sometimes we have to break it down to smaller pieces. Some user stories you see here. One epic have two child requirement or child stories or something like that. You can simply click child button here and then choose story type and give a name like story and click on the create button. So you see once the creation is done, this story will be associated to this particular epic as a child. So if you're going further, for example, open a user story. So you see here the user story issue type. You see all the description are there. So of course you can specify whatever you want to describe what kind of features you want to implement in your system. And then you see here at the same thing for the user story, you may want to break it down to even smaller pieces, some tasks for your dev team. So you see I created 2 tasks for my developers. If you keep going to open your task, you can also, for example, specify the estimation for that. For example, I have to give 16 hours workload for this particular task. If I click on the add update button, you see here the time tracking will have values displayed there. So it's quite easy to track the working status from your dev team. Yeah, that's actually the hierarchy and how we break down the high level requirements like epics to stories to tasks, how it works inside Jira with SynapseRT plugin. Thanks.
Thanks, Cheney.
Yeah, let me stop my share. Okay.
Okay, so we've gone through epics and user stories. And the next thing really is thinking about how to do user stories. I wouldn't say the right way, but a well-practiced way and what we found works. And that is to really think about the user story, of course, from the user point of view. But what's really important about this is thinking about the value or benefit from the user's point of view. And the reason that we bring this up is that sometimes if you bring up why, which is the why this is going to get done or why, how the user will benefit from it, then it's possible for the developers and the QA staff to really think a lot deeper in terms of how to test it. So here's just some examples. I'm not going to read through them, but I think if you look at the last one, we want to have a very specific value, but there are some things that we still don't know, and those unknown things are actually could be test cases. User stories cannot be lonely. They have to go with acceptance criteria. So when Cheney was showing the description, we like to put when you have the tests, each test in this description should have the criteria that go with that. So let's get into acceptance criteria. Acceptance criteria, here's just some quotes I found from different sources, friends that I've talked to about acceptance testing. And really, just 3 ways of emphasizing the coupling of acceptance tests with user stories in order to ensure traceability, because based on the acceptance criteria, then we're going to develop sets of tests that go with those acceptance criteria, and then the tests can also be associated with the user story. So we can go back and forth and say, okay, what tests do I have with these user stories, or what user stories are associated with these tests? Of course, user acceptance criteria can include other things outside of just functional, the function of the software. It could include performance or security or usability as well. One important thing is that there should be a yes/no as far as satisfying the criteria, or a very, very clear pass or fail result. just think that your purpose is to add certainty to what the team is building, to add certainty that they know that they've built the right thing. Because what's going to happen, or what should happen, is these user stories are fully developed along with the criteria. And then this is actually a form of test-driven development, right? They're seeing the tests that it's going to be matched up against before they start coding. We could talk about ambiguity and how to eliminate ambiguity, but that would probably be a half-an-hour session by itself. But I think that there are many sources on the internet about how to write user stories without ambiguity. What's important is just to make sure that it's very, very clear about what is acceptable and what's not acceptable. One thing about acceptance criteria is that it is not a solution, but it is an intent. So if you look at this example here, on the first example, we have a manager can approve or disapprove an audit form. That's very clear. The next one actually steps into the implementation, which is not what we want to do. We want to have the criteria separate from the implementation. Next, what we like to do is use a certain language when writing acceptance criteria with this given, when, then type formula that enables you to write acceptance criteria in a consistent format, and kind of, it's in a way, it's a checklist to make sure that your acceptance criteria are sound. Here are some examples of using these terms: given and shall. Given an existing reference prescription, when it is removed, then it shall no longer appear in the lookup list. I'm sure that you can think up of a lot of different examples as well. Normally we would do an exercise where we change these criteria into the proper language, but I'll leave that up to you on your own. I do have a question for you though, and that is, what else should be an acceptance criteria? And maybe you could, if you want to respond with Q&A, that would be great. But I'll just go ahead and answer the question here. The answer is what cannot be done. So we want to have acceptance criteria that also include negative testing as well. So think about that when you're generating your acceptance criteria: what can be done satisfactorily versus what should not be able to be done satisfactorily. The whole point of this slide is to really think carefully through who actually is going to be doing the acceptance and who's going to be doing the testing. Is the tester the one that does the acceptance? And I invite you to really think carefully about that when you have your retrospectives, or when you look at the test results, who actually passed that test. And that brings us to the discussion about product owners. The product owner is the one that represents the user in acceptance testing, and they must show up. They need to be clear on the criteria. They need to be clear on the acceptance test. They need to represent the user and be there. They also should be pulling in others to represent end users into the conversation. So some of the others could be different types of end users. If you're developing an accounting system, for example, you may pull in an accounts receivable person. You may pull in somebody that works on the general ledger. You may pull in the CFO who looks at high-level reports, income statements, and balance sheets, and so on. So you want to pull in the different types of users as the product owner. As a best practice, we like to include real customer panels or focus groups in helping us to create acceptance criteria and tests. But you know, sometimes you don't have time for that, or you can't access those users. And so anyone that has the voice of the customer in mind should be able to make a contribution to developing the acceptance criteria. Next, let's take a look at connecting user stories with these criteria, and then connecting the criteria with tests. So what we're going to do is go through this with Cheney, and I'm going to turn this over to Cheney, where you show the test description, where the test objective with the criteria, steps, results, and how that goes back to the user story for traceability. So I'm going to turn it over to you now, Cheney.
Sure. Okay, I'm going to share my screen. So here, let's just open the user story again. And you see Jira natively doesn't have any features for test management. That means if you are using Jira to track your requirement, you will not get any tests related information. So, but with our plugin SynapseRT installed, you will get some additional features like you see here. Inside the user story, there is a test case section. It helps user to create test case directly from a user story here. For example, a new test case, something like that. So when you read your user story and you think the user story need to be tested by some test case, you can start your test case creation from test case section directly. So these test keys will be associated to this particular user story. So sometimes you may want to check, okay, I have test cases there. I want to check the result. So what you can do is that you can simply expand the test cases you linked to this particular user story. So all the test execution histories will display as a colored block here. Red means it is failed. If you click on that, execution details will pop up with all the details of your execution. And if you want to check more, for example, I want to see all the defects reported against this particular user story. You see here, there is a defects panel will list all the defects reported from these associated test cases. That means these defects are also from this particular user story. Now let's open a test case inside from a user story. You see it is a test case issue type. So you can put your test objective here inside description field. And also we provide test step panel here to give you step information and expected result information. And here we have a requirement panel which shows all the requirements covered by this particular test case. So even more, when you open this test case, you are able to know test case execution history from each different test plans. Yeah, that's it for.
I think it's important to note, Cheney, if you go up a little bit, that on the description, it's up to you, up to the user to input the criteria in the format that they want. So we usually recommend, as we were talking about the acceptance criteria, putting it in there for people to develop tests against.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Let me pass my screen to you.
Alrighty. Okay. Well, thanks very much. We didn't show did we show the test plan and execution history? We can show that later.
But, yeah, I will show it later.
Yeah. Okay. One more thing, as Steve Jobs used to say on acceptance tests, and that is to make them reusable and independent whenever possible, thinking about automation along the way. And I know that the SynapseRT plugin has an automation interface, but we're not going to be talking about that today. But and by the way, XPO South has no interest in SynapseRT or GoToGroup. We're just great partners, and we really love the plugin and how it works and how it supports our clients. Here's one quote from a colleague of mine. We don't have automated acceptance tests, which would be nice. At one time I was working toward it, but it was deprioritized by management. Isn't that too bad? Jeez. Let's now talk about planning tests from your requirements. And I think this is where you start talking about what we just mentioned about the test plan, right, Cheney?
Yes. Let me share my screen.
Yep. I'll let you do your thing.
Yep. Yeah, so to do test planning, of course, you need to create a test plan first. For example, I want to test a list of user stories or epics. I can give a name like regression, stories in version 10, something like that. So create a test plan first, and then open this test plan. So we're gonna add test cases from requirement directly. So you can click on the requirement button and search all your version 10 requirements or user stories. You see here, all my user stories and epics will be filtered out. So once I add these requirements to the test plan, you see here for test case panel, all the test cases associated to these user stories and epics will be added inside this test plan. So now the next step is to create a cycle. For example, round 1 for Firefox testing, and environment is Firefox, build information, something like that, and add. So we just selected test cases from user stories because we are going to test our user stories. Now I created a test cycle. So the next step is that you can do your test assignment from Jira like this way. Assign to, for example, my tester's name is Cheney, and then assign. You see the tester information will be changed. And then you can start your cycle and finish your test execution like this way. Pass every step and then go to next one and give result for each different steps. And if it is failed, you can simply mark it as failed and create a defect from that particular test case. And then close. You see here shows how we start testing from our requirement, and I updated 2 test cases. One is for passed, another one is failed, and there's a defect reported. Yeah, this is how to do test planning from requirement. So once all these test case execution were done, the result will be updated for each of requirement here. For example, if I click here, you see for this particular user story, I have created 2 test cases to cover it. You see one is passed, another one is failed. So it's quite easy to get the result from this test plan. Yeah, that's for requirement testing, planning, and execution.
That's great.
Yeah. Go ahead, Phil.
Yep, my turn. Okay, thank you, Cheney. So the problem is, as you all know, that user stories are always changing, right? And so what we want to do is be able to manage that process of change within the iterations and track what happens between the versions of the requirements or the versions of the user stories. So, Cheney, can you show us how that's done with SynapseRT?
Sure. Please pass the screenshot to me.
Yep. Okay.
Okay, share again. Can you see my screen?
Yep.
Okay. Let's go back to the the first page and open a user story here. So it is a user story. So user story is kind of software requirement as defined in SynapseRT. So sometimes you see once the product manager, they change something in the description and change some other fields. They want to create a version for that. And then after some times they change something else and create another version for that. Finally, they want to do some change history tracking or compare different versions. So actually, SynapseRT provide a versioning feature here. You can create a version for your requirement and give some version notes like this way and click on the create button. And then if you scroll down to the bottom, here is a versions tab to list all the versions created by user. So sometimes if you want to track the change or to track what happened, so you can simply select two versions and click on the compare button. You will see the difference between version 1 and 3. If you only want to say, okay, I only want to see the changed files, so you can just go here. Okay, all these highlighted texts, they are new added ones or changed ones, something like that. This is for versioning feature for a single requirement. But you say sometimes one or dev team, they are working on a set of requirements. Then we want to say, okay, I want to make a snapshot for the current sprint, for all the requirements in current sprint. So that kind of snapshot or versioning, we call it as baseline. Baselining of requirement means you can create a version for a set of requirements. So for example, here, I have already created a baseline 2. I have a list of requirements here with different versions. So once baseline is created, so our dev team can just start work on this snapshot of my requirements, because any change in the future will not come into here. That means the new change will not impact the current development process. So if you want to compare, you can compare the two different baselines to see what has been changed. For example, what user stories has been added or removed from the baseline. That is the feature of a requirement baselining.
So what happens if the CEO comes and talks directly to the developer, says, hey, I want to change this?
Usually it could not happen because we have baselines. All the developers, they are following the baseline version of requirements. They will refuse any new import. Otherwise, you see the dev process will be impacted by the new change. At least in the current sprint, the scope shouldn't be changed. Then in the new sprint, you may add some new things or you may change some requirements. That can be done in that way, actually.
Yeah, so we tell the CEO that he should go in and edit the user story and make changes.
Yeah, and create a new version.
Yeah, and create a new version.
Yeah, for next sprint or for next phase. Yeah.
Right.
Yep.
Okay.
Okay, I pass it to you.
Sure.
Val?
Yep. Alrighty, so I think what you just saw Cheney discussing about how to create a snapshot of a set of requirements called a baseline or a version that you could use for the requirements or user stories that you're going to be working on within a sprint. And like you said, those things should not change within a sprint. And of course, there's, things that get added somehow and other things that don't get taken out somehow and changes and so on. But the whole tool is supposed to support you in tracking those changes and understanding that when you make a change in the middle of a sprint, it does impact a lot of things. Yeah, this is actually part of that in terms of negotiating the quality and the timeline and the amount of things that, the amount of stories that get put into an iteration and the negotiating that takes on, and how to, it's important to split large stories into smaller ones so that you can actually accomplish something tangible within a sprint. And that's why you divide user stories sometimes into tasks and subtasks. I think it goes without saying that when you manage requirements in an agile process, that just the simple fact that you're using agile means that you should not be planning too far out, because the information that you gain from one sprint is going to impact the next sprint. You may have things that took longer than you thought, or you may gain knowledge about a feature that makes you think it through a little bit more deeply and add something onto it. So we encourage our clients to not plan out too far, more than 2 or 3 sprints. After all, they're going to be changed anyway, so it's best just to keep it really short, working on one sprint and the next 1 or 2 sprints at a time. I think you've already done this, Cheney, but did you already show this, Cheney, in terms of being able to show the traceability of user story with the tests and the defects?
Yeah, I can show something here new. I mean, show something new here.
Yeah.
Traceability metrics as well.
Right. Yeah, it's important.
Okay. Yeah. Let me share my screen again. So, okay, now let's open a user story again. And you see what we can get from a user story is that we can do traceability between user story and the test cases and the test execution result and also the defect. When we open a test case, we can do the traceability between test case to requirements which were covered by this particular test case. If we open a defect, we are able to know from which test case the defect is reported, and also the impacted requirement will be listed here as well. So you see everything: requirement, test keys, test result, and defects. They are all linked together. Beside this one, if you want to get a big picture, you can go to our traceability metrics here. Just select a version to filter your requirement and test plan, and click on the trace button. You will get a traceability matrix like this way. For example, this one, FRS2, it is a user story. So here shows all the test cases created or associated to this particular user story. And here the colored blocks means a different test result from each different test plans and test cycles. If you see there is a defect icon, means there are some defects reported from the linked test case. That means all these defects are also from that particular user story. So from this matrix, it's quite easy to read that information from requirement to test keys to execution result to defect. So all these are connected together. Yeah, that's a traceability file. I pass it on you.
Great, thanks, Cheney. Okay. Okay, great. So what Cheney just showed you was how to connect all of these things together, and going backwards and forwards in seeing the associations, which I think is really, really important. Oh, we've got a question here. Jan is asking, if a user acceptance tester finds that something is not included in the test cases, do you allow them to enter this information directly into Jira? Or do you have the QAs enter their findings? Is there a way to have the user acceptance tester do this securely? I'm not sure many acceptance testers are familiar with Jira, so you may not want them to do this, or they may not be comfortable using Jira. That's a good question, Jan. Yeah, user acceptance tester is somebody from the business, and you're right, they may not be comfortable in actually entering stuff into Jira, and they also may find something that is not in a test case. And so what we would do actually would be to give them something that works for them, and it's usually in the format of a spreadsheet, which has fields that would map directly to fields in a Jira ticket or a defect ticket. And of course, the steps and expected steps that could be used by the QAs, not only in generating the defect, but also in generating and developing a test case that can be used in the future. I hope that answered. So, test planning, ensuring that user stories are tested. Test plan. Did you go over this, Cheney?
I've already done that.
Yeah, I think you did, right.
Yeah, you can skip it.
Yeah. Takeaways. Okay, let's sum up the takeaways for today. I think that putting UAT into Agile really requires a discipline and a focus on user stories and having the product owner be very participative, not only themselves, but dragging others who have other stakeholders who have a vested interest into developing those user stories, as well as the criteria. Developing the acceptance criteria is really critical. And those acceptance criteria have to be very clear with a yes, no, pass, or fail. And then, of course, you have testing that matches those criteria. And we really need to put into the acceptance testing, as I mentioned before, not only the things that we're expecting to happen, but all the things that we're not expecting to happen have to go into the test criteria as well. Lastly, UAT in Agile requires you to be agile, right? And that means that you cannot plan too far out. We really don't recommend planning out more than 2 sprints. And it's important to have multiple people working on and refining and grooming those stories. We talk about defect triage, which is developers, product analysts, and testers getting together and examining defects. We like to have user story triages where the product manager or the product analyst is meeting with the developer and testers and going through the user stories before they become defects, and making sure that the stories are testable before any development occurs. In this way, you can really identify unknowns and things that are not clear in the stories before they get developed. Today we had, I was fortunate enough to have Cheney join us from GoToGroup. GoToGroup produces the SynapseRT plugin for Jira, and we use this a lot with our clients. We don't sell it, but if you want to investigate taking a deeper look at the plugin, we covered the requirements, traceability aspect of the plugin, as well as some of the test management and execution capabilities. But it also has 2 other key capabilities in a test automation interface with a REST API, as well as reporting and test case management. So that's we'll have to save that for another webinar. And so you see Cheney's email there. You can reach out to him if you have questions on SynapseRT. I think that's it for today. I hope that you've enjoyed the webinar, and we will be sending out an email which will give you the link for the recording as well as the slides. So thanks a lot, everyone, and we'll see you next quarter for the XPOsoft quarterly webinar. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.